You're skeptical of the state. You're getting over the myth of authority.
But the state is still formidable. Or is it?
You've got a front row seat in the transition to a free society.
Let's dive headfirst into
The White Pill Box with your host, Mark Maresca.
Greetings all. Thank you so much for joining today. Today, I want to discuss a recent exchange between Tom Woods and Michael Malice. Tom had Michael on his show, and they covered a lot of topics, but one in particular really struck me. By way of preface, let me say that I'm not criticizing either of them. This isn't that kind of review. I admire both of these men, and also I love watching their friendship. From what I could tell, these two are really close friends, and I always enjoy just watching them interact as friends. The topic I wanted to cover that they hit on was essentially the masses, the majority of people, and how they aren't really red-pilled, and most of them never will be. And then the standard libertarian takeaway from this. As you know, I love this topic. My observation is that the psychology of the majority and their relevance in the scheme of things, all that is mostly pondered a bit too surface level, I think, by our thinkers in the libertarian space. From what I could see, they mostly operate from a few common assumptions, then draw their conclusions from that. I think you'll see that illustrated in these clips. Again, I'm not taking digs at Tom or Michael here. What I'm doing is pointing out that even among the best of us, it's tempting to take a surface level intuitive impression and run with it to further conclusions. So let me show you these 3 short clips and I'll comment. Here we go.
On your Twitter feed, you posted, it was one of these memes about hard to swallow pills. And this particular hard to swallow pill is there's a ceiling to how many people can be red pilled, and it's pretty low.
Yes.
Now, it took me a long time to realize that, but I agree with you. So how do you stay personally optimistic in the face of a world in which the vast majority of people will never see reality clearly?
Now, right after Tom spoke there, Michael mentioned that he doesn't worry about what the masses think. The government doesn't care anyway. What the majority thinks is not relevant. Not to him, not to the state. It's a waste to think about it. Now, there's a lot there, but I want you to notice 2 things right off the bat. Tom's comments. There's a limit to how many people can be red-pilled. And then his question, how do you stay optimistic? Now, look at what's packed in there. He takes for granted that people being red-pilled is important. Based on that, he wonders how you stay optimistic. So his first assumption gets internalized that a lot of people getting red-pilled is important, implying it's necessary. It's not happening, obviously, so the assumption leads to the feeling of demoralization. We need them red-pilled. They're not going to get there, so that's depressing. We're already down a road that we only took because of an assumption. So the obvious next step is to ask how you stay optimistic, since after all, we already feel demoralized. See how that happened? An assumption up front leads us to feel down, and now we have to climb out of that down feeling. Okay, I just wanted you to notice that thought process, very common among us, and by the way, me too, for most of my time as a libertarian. And again, Michael's response to console Tom is showing him how Michael doesn't attribute relevance to what the majority think, like saying, why stress yourself out over it? I see Michael here as closer to the mark than Tom, although he does miss the huge white pill, which you only find by looking clearly at the majority more deeply, but I'll get to that. So, next clip.
Yeah, but I guess the point is, if it were the other way around with the 80-20, we would be much closer to having the kind of world we would prefer to live in.
That's probably true. That's probably true.
But I can't bring that about, so I guess that's why it matters. And so you might be inclined to say, oh, well, this stinks. Now I can't have the world I want because I'm surrounded by these people.
But I can't have the world I want not because of these people.
So here, Tom basically says the majority is an impediment because if they were libertarian, 80%, we'd be closer. Michael agrees about the 80-20, but he repeats that the impediment is not the masses. He emphasizes the state does what it wants, not what the masses want. Now, step back again here. Tom assumes, again, as we all have generally done, that the majority play a more or less conscious role, in the sense that the more of them that think libertarian, the closer we are. But I say that is assuming the wrong role that the masses have in all this, an assumed role, saying they need to be red-pilled in enough numbers. That's the assumption. Again, we'll cover this in a minute. Finally, the last clip.
Well, true, but I think back to the old days. Like, I thought, because of the Ron Paul campaigns, that a huge number of people were going to start to understand the world. And it was a huge number, just not nearly huge enough.
Now here, Tom assumed the Ron Paul support would translate to the ideas spreading to the masses more. He saw the enthusiasm of the Ron Paul experience. He was part of it. So it's a very meaningful and emotional experience for him. He set expectations of what could happen if that enthusiasm spread. And of course, his logical, nerdy mind, that mind most of us nerdy types have, saw the logic and reason of the libertarian anarchist principles, and they figured people are going to jump on this once they open their eyes. So let's acknowledge this was hope that came from their own inner feelings of excitement. Now, right after that, Michael gets more real about the Ron Paul enthusiasm that happened, that it wasn't that huge really as compared to the general population. Plus, the masses going along with good or bad impressions, not so much ideas. So when they are supporting someone like Ron Paul, mostly they are not understanding the details. They themselves are going along with feelings of hope and generalized impressions. Okay, those are the clips. We have a few takeaways from the participants. Tom sees the majority as the impediment. Michael doesn't. It's the state itself that does what it wants, regardless. He sees the majority as pretty much a non-player character in the game. Okay, let's dive in now. Tom got demoralized when the majority did not embrace the Ron Paul moment, the libertarian ideas. And by the way, if you've followed Tom for some time, you'd know he got super demoralized after COVID too. He's made that very clear since the COVID experience, how people so easily gave up their freedoms. And by the way, many libertarians were also disappointed in the majority. So Tom here represents a quite common feeling among the voluntarist population. So let's break this down. I have to go back to the importance of the myth of political authority as the root cause of the state. You need that myth for the state to exist at all and for the state to persist. The myth is the whole ball game. Well, that makes the majority of people the critical player here. Why? Because they're the ones who hold the myth in their heads. The myth lives there. So they are critically important. But that's not a conscious role. It's psychological. And here's how. The myth sits there in their heads. They act it out in words and deeds, this idea that they welcome rulers over them. This is the environment, the cultural, social environment created by the ubiquitous myth of authority. Well, this environment ends up being really welcoming and hospitable to the power seekers, the bully types who like to lord over people's lives. There it is, cause and effect. Myth leads to state, the root cause. If libertarian messaging has any basic purpose, it's to disabuse people of the myth. That's Tom, Michael, and 1,000 other libertarian messengers saying things and writing things that try to get people to see the state as an illegitimate authority, Same for me and all of us when we've messaged to others. But we really never looked at that cause and effect in detail. Instead, we kind of sort of assumed that getting people red-pilled will translate into some sort of actions that get us closer to a free society. That was the extent of the predictions. But our thinking stopped right there. A big misstep was assuming getting red-pilled was all that mattered. Just like Tom mentioned how there's a limit to how many people can be red-pilled. Remember that assumption? They just got to get red-pilled. End of story. But that's where we went off course. Nope, it's not how many or what percentage get red-pilled, meaning fully over their belief in statism. What counts is when the majority simply gets incrementally more skeptical of the state. They don't have to get red-pilled all the way. Yeah, it's a bonus if they do, but think about a little skepticism multiplied by a whole lot of people. And now, just look around. You're seeing a whole lot of people way more skeptical, just plain more skeptical of the state than just a short 5-10 years ago. Now bring back the cause and effect, the collective behaviors of the majority who are now more skeptical. Those collective behaviors set an environment that's not like before, not quite as welcoming and hospitable for the bully types out there, politicians, law enforcement, military, less attractive than before. You're going to tell me that politicians and cops are feeling just as cocky and confident as they did back 15, 20 years ago? You're going to tell me they don't look more desperate than they did? You might want to check the recruitment numbers for police and military. Yeah, the environment is changing, and it's not because there's more anarchists. It's this bucket of skepticism starting to top off, with thimblefuls of a bit of skepticism added by the common man, multiplied by enormous numbers in the majority. But here's the thing. The masses are being passive all the way. No one is asking them to read books or follow and subscribe to Tom Woods or anyone else. The environment is changing simply from that organic increase in skepticism. I made an analogy for this. All of society, a huge, gigantic ship, like a monster cruise ship. Most of it is the majority, of course. What steers it, puts it in a direction? Nope, it's not the majority. It's probably a combination of influencers, impactful real-world events, plus random chance. All that are the small rudders that direct the ship, but not the masses. Their role is passive. But because they're the majority, they keep the thing moving by inertia. They're passive, but they move things in that already determined direction. The rudders steer things in a little bit different direction, the influencers, whatever, but the majority's passive inertia pushes it along that way. But see, as their skepticism grows, this makes their enthusiasm for rulers shrink. The environment morphs into a less attractive environment for the bullies. The bullies slowly lose relevance in that environment. The direction shifts away from statism. This is again organic, not planned, but now we can actually appreciate the value of the majority's passive inertia, the decreasing feeling of the need for rulers that gets normalized for the majority. And they passively keep the inertia of that going. So as far as the majority goes, it's not a good or bad judgment about them. They go along with the general trends. We might not like that they spent most of history passively supporting statism, but we're transitioning now. Once we're almost there, the inertia of the majority is exactly what's going to push us across the finish line. Okay, let me comment on how easy it's been to harshly judge the majority, especially for going along with the worst atrocities, like slavery. They grew up being taught slavery is normal. So passively, they assumed it was okay. The majority had nothing to do with consciously ending slavery, but eventually enough was changing in the culture to where the majority was feeling like it was not a good thing anymore. And then today, no one would tolerate it. That's the inertia of the majority insulating us pretty well from ever being able to return to slavery passively. Same for the fall of the Soviet Union. The majority over there passively went along with it for like 70 years because they were trained to think it was a good thing until the cracks formed. And in Michael Malice's book, The White Pill, he goes into extraordinary detail here. But as things were changing, those changes in perspective were working through society on the ground too. It was as much a growing skepticism of the Soviet Union by the masses as much as by the military and political elites. When it fell, the majority was ready for it to fall. Passively, though. And then there's COVID, and here's the most palpable example libertarians use to show how easily the majority go along. But let me challenge that, because again, it doesn't account for psychology. I explained this in my major COVID essay from 2020, which I'll link to, where I argued the experience was history's most extreme example of mass hysteria. Sure, people went along in lockstep with shutdowns, school closures, stay-at-home vaccine mandates. People even snitched on neighbors and friends. These were behaviors that really, truly soured people like Tom Woods regarding the majority. But I'm not defending it, I'm explaining it. Ask what happens in people's minds when they are psychologically pushed to an extremity. Because they were in COVID. They were told this was a catastrophic threat to humanity. You remember this. Their indoctrination was so powerful that they believed what the state, what science experts were telling them. They were put into a state of fear like nothing we've ever seen. And this was global. How in the heck would you have expected people to act if you really consider the threat that was communicated, plus knowing how much they were propagandized all their life to trust the state? If you look at it that way, it's not really a shock. Plus, if people were really totally blind sheep like that, let me ask, why did the mandates stop? You're going to argue the state was benevolent and decided they'd gone too far? No way. Those mandates would still be with us if the state could have gotten away with it. But they're not with us anymore. They fizzled out a year or so in. Why? Because the environment that was welcoming to COVID-style authoritarianism was starting to change. Enough of that bucket of skepticism about it was filling up, changing the environment to be not so hospitable to those mandates. The bullies of the state sensed it, I think mostly unconsciously, that they couldn't really keep it up anymore, and they backed off. So it was the majority in a sense, but here again, passively having had enough. So now back to the lesson I want to draw from the example clips of Tom and Michael. Libertarians like Tom, most of them really, are demoralized because they see how hard it is to red pill the majority. They realize nowhere near 80% are ever going to be at that place, and that saddens them. They think we'll never have a free world because the majority are standing in the way. Now we see the misunderstanding here. The majority aren't making statism. They are passively believing a myth that fuels statism, passively. To fix this, the majority don't have to consciously rethink statism. We don't have to try to get them to put von Mises on their bookshelves. It's the mistake that what the majority think is what counts. But that's off target. I'll explain it another way. I'll use the digital versus analog argument. So think of a volume dial on a speaker. That's analog, meaning as you dial, you travel a scale from lower to higher and back again. But digital means typically an on and off condition, either or, like a radio tuner that has preset stations. You click a button and you're on the specific precise station. Unclick and you're off it. Either or, black or white, yes or no. There's no sliding scale like with analog. Digital is true or false. Okay, so the idea of being red-pilled, we've been guilty of assuming it was digital. A person is either red-pilled or not. We know being red-pilled means you don't accept the legitimacy of government, period. Black and white. So the conclusion, and this is more or less stated by Tom and the rest of us, I was guilty of it. If you're not red-pilled yet, you're among the majority impeding progress. That's been a mistake. What counts is the analog psychology of skepticism. The scale of skepticism going from no skepticism to a little, to more than a little, to some, to more than some, to a lot, to a whole lot, to ideally being all the way red-pilled. What we missed was this. Every step along the way counts for something. It adds to the total bucket of skepticism. That changes the environment in an analog way. Incrementally more skepticism means an incrementally less hospitable environment to the bully types, the power lovers. That analog environment just isn't as attractive to them over time, over that changing scale of the environment. With time, they, the potential bullies, are making different life choices that entice them away from the political world. So back to the assumptions we saw in those clips. First, that assumed limit to how many people can be red-pilled. Okay, sure, there's a limit, but that limit is meaningless. Just like there's a limit to how many people know how to make a pencil, which, as Tom and every good libertarian knows, is exactly zero. Because the point is, people don't have to be personally red-pilled any more than they have to understand circuit design and GPS technology to use their cell phone. Being red-pilled is not the means to the end of statism. The means to that starts with the root cause, the myth of political authority. As that erodes, the state erodes in kind. So what really matters, then, is the psychology of the erosion of the myth. Check it out. Look no further than the real world. Right now, and just the last 5-10 years, we see it eroding in the minds of people by noticing the increase in general skepticism. No, not everywhere, and I know it's only just starting right now, but it's a hell of a lot more skepticism than it was 15 years ago, let alone 20, 30 years ago. And we know that's not at all a libertarian awakening. Nope. It's just thimblefuls of skepticism adding to the bucket over a massive number of regular people among the majority. It's there for us to see. All you got to do is look. And then the next question, the one about how do you stay optimistic? Well, we don't have to struggle over getting optimistic about a false assumption like we need 80% red-pilled. How about being optimistic that the way out is happening already? It's the growing skepticism because government propaganda is weakening. Its handmaidens like corporate media and academia are buckling. It's there for all to see, and it sure is white-pilling for me. I would hope it would make you optimistic too. Michael is right. Don't worry about what the masses think. What they think is not relevant. It's enough that they are starting to get skeptical of authority. That's happening organically, and they are going along with that trend passively. Let's be glad that's finally happening, and we're living to see it. It means we're witnessing the transition to a free society right in front of us. Yeah, I'd say that's reason for optimism, which smashes another assumption about hoping for 80% libertarian. Now we can see it better. Just like with cell phone circuits, it's going to be enough that scholars and legal theorists understand the principles of libertarianism, how human action works, how economics works, how money works, how dispute resolution works, how property works. Those foundational elements have been developed over the last 50 years and continue to be refined, but the majority doesn't need to understand any of it. The majority are doing their job, passively continuing the inertia of the trend toward greater skepticism. They don't have to know what's happening. Nice. So much off our plate, which means we can have the world Tom wants, the world we all want. The majority are not in the way. You know, it's almost ironic, Tom saying he doesn't get the world he wants. Ironic because his disappointment with the majority over COVID seemed to be one of the motivations that shifted his focus over to efforts that just disregard the state. He's put together a community of people who choose to interact with the like-minded, online communities plus actual real-world interactions. That's how his school of life evolved. I'll link to that. It's the world he wants by his own hand, in a sense. But I also get it. He wants the world free at large, so his own children and their children don't have to struggle as much. But here is where those assumptions bite us in the butt. We assumed the majority are a conscious impediment, as if they've rejected libertarianism. But it's none of that. They don't accept or reject it. They're indoctrinated into statism and acting accordingly. Just like COVID, they got traumatized into acting almost inhumanely. But let's calm down. They were driven to an extremity. Now, I, for one, won't forgive the statist bullies who put us all there, but we can be understanding of the majority for having the shit scared out of them. And then we can have optimism because it's clear the same thing won't work again for the state. The majority have been inoculated. I don't mean with the vaccine. I mean psychologically inoculated. They're a bit more skeptical now. After all, the state hasn't been able to repeat the performance. That's a white pill. And COVID provides a real explicit example of the general point I'm making, that overall the majority are getting more skeptical. A huge white pill. So anyway, that's my take on this exchange between Tom Woods and Michael Malice. I do think it's a fair representation of the frustration libertarians tend to feel about the majority. I hope I've given you something to think about. If it sparked interest, I hope you check out my full Myth of Authority series, which is a deep dive into all of this. And it's an explosion of unexpected white pills, too. So for that reason, I hope you check it out. So I'll wrap things up there. Thanks for joining today. Take care, and see you next time.
Thanks so much to all subscribers and everyone who joined today. And remember, keep looking for those white pills.